Hi. Earlier, while chatting with Erica Sapphire, she mentioned her grandmother.
If you go back a couple of generations, my grandmother saw people dying with 1918 flu. My grandmother saw children paralyzed with polio. My parents couldn't go to the swimming pool in the summer because there was polio.
Summer was polio season, a concept that you may personally have never even heard of. Yet when I was a kid, as June, July approached, my parents were terrified. Although polio is a disease with historical records going all the way back to ancient Egypt, the ominous threat of poliomyelitis, or infantile paralysis, peaked at the beginning of the 20th century. It was June 6, 1916, when little John Pomares, a 10-month-old infant living at 53 Garfield Place in Brooklyn, New York, suddenly developed high fever and paralysis. In the next 2 days, 5 more neighborhood kids came down with similar symptoms. And by the end of a month, it was evident that a raging polio epidemic was in full force. That summer of 1916, 27,000 people got polio, 9,000 were paralyzed, and 2,400 had died. These were scary times, and no one really understood what actually caused the disease. Officials forced strict sanitary codes. House quarantines were imposed on the homes of victims. Hundreds of stray cats and dogs were killed for fear that they might be transmitting the disease. Yet despite all measures, the number of paralyzed kids continued to rise, and only the cold weather of winter was able to curb the epidemic. So, for the next 40 years, summers were polio season. In 1921, polio shocked the U.S. in a very personal way. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of America's rising political stars, was polio-stricken. Roosevelt was very much in the public eye as the vice presidential candidate who had just lost the 1920 presidential elections to Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Now, crippled, it seemed as if his career was over. Obviously, as we all know, this was not the case. Polio is a virus of the family of Picornaviridae, tiny naked RNA viruses, hence the family name. Pico meaning tiny plus RNA, together picoRNA, picorna. Its positive strand RNA genome consists of 7,500 bases and codes for a polyprotein that is cleaved into 10 proteins for which viral protein 1, VP1, through VP4 comprise the capsid. Polio is a naked virus, meaning that it doesn't have a lipid envelope. The virus is normally transmitted fecal-orally. However, it can also infect people living in areas with limited access to running water or flush toilets, where drinking water is likely to be contaminated by infected human waste. This route of infection is referred to as infection via a common vehicle, that is to say, contaminated water supplies. Fortunately, although the virus is very contagious, in 72% of those infected, it presents as a subclinical asymptomatic infection of the gut. As a result, most carriers are totally unaware that daily, as they relieve themselves, they pass infectious virus into the sewage system and the environment, and viruses that can ultimately spread and cause disease to others. There are 2 modes of clinical disease that do develop symptoms. In 25% of those infected, a minor disease called abortive poliomyelitis may ensue, in which sore throat, nausea, fever, and flu-like symptoms can appear. These infections do not involve the central nervous system, the CNS. It's only in about 0.5% of those that get infected with polio is the CNS actually involved. The virus at first infects the gut and subsequently makes its way to the bloodstream and then ultimately infects nerve cells and causes paralysis. At first, efforts to study the virus were slow, as it proved difficult to produce virus in tissue culture. However, In 1949, John Enders, along with Frederick Robbins and Thomas Weller, discovered that polio replicates well and efficiently in embryonic human skin and muscle tissue cultures. This opened the door to extensive scientific investigation and discoveries about how polio infects our body and causes disease. For these breakthroughs, these three scientists received the 1954 Nobel Prize in Medicine. Now, getting back to Roosevelt. In the presidential elections of 1932, Roosevelt beat the incumbent President Herbert Hoover and took office as the 32nd President of the United States. President Roosevelt made polio research and the development of a protective vaccine a major goal of his presidency. First, he declared that people should dance so that others may walk, and established the annual birthday balls where in hundreds of cities around the United States, formal dancing balls were used to celebrate the president's birthday and raise millions of dollars totally devoted to the care of polio victims and support polio research. The fundraising became a grassroots effort of the people, and no donation was too small. The March of Dimes was established, and thousands of letters containing dimes, quarters, and nickels from children and adults alike flooded and literally overwhelmed the White House postal offices. Although President Roosevelt did not live to see the success of his efforts, within a decade of his passing, his commitment and tenacity to fight polio paid off. 2 effective vaccines were developed, and today, polio is just about beaten. Oh, and one last point. Did you ever notice whose bust is on the U.S. dime? That's right, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself, commemorating his commitment to the fight of polio and to his March of Dimes.